Welcome to the Massey Summit on Cities. Bienvenue au sommet sur les villes de Massey College. Mon nom est Nathalie Rosiers. My name is Nathalie Rosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. And I'm one of the conveners of this conference with my colleagues, Alexandra Friend, Richard Albert, and Alan Kaspersky. So it's our pleasure to have you here. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, land that was inhabited by many Indigenous people over centuries. It is the cherished land of the Seneca, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas. The credit, we want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. Poignantly, yesterday, one of our colleagues from Brazil was quite clear about cities, and she described it this way. So her name is Marina Costa Esteves Coutinho, and she said, cities are the place where both violations and perfections of human rights are happening daily. And Patricia Wood also described our cities as often deliberate places of oppression at certain times in our history. So the project of constitutional space for cities is certainly about ensuring that cities deliver what they are meant to deliver and that they do so in the public good. It's not just about more power, it's about responsibilities, it's about accountability, and we want them to deliver services, but we want them to deliver as well on the human rights front, on the fight against climate change, and also, importantly, in confronting inequality, discrimination, and racism. The racism that is embedded, that institutionalized, and that's a little bit what we're going to be talking about today. It's my great pleasure to have with me in this conversation Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, who is a professor at the Department of Sociology at University of Toronto. He's a senior fellow at Massey College. He's indeed our incoming chair of the governing board. So I am, he's going to be my boss. So I am particularly happy to welcome here on this important conversation. He also received many awards, more recently the president of U of T's Impact Award, a fabulous award to represent the impact of his research on current issues. So I know that his full bio will be on the chat, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but I just want to say thank you so much, Akwasi, for being here, for engaging on this conversation about cities and policing. Now I know, and I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit, we decided to discuss this recent report that's entitled Rethinking Community Safety, a Step Forward for Toronto, a report that I understand you were partly supervising or providing advice to, but it's such an important report because it does get at many issues that we've been discussing a lot, and I think it kind of pushes some bubbles and kind of really reclaims almost a new agenda for community safety. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the context of the report, how you went about it, and then we'll go into the substance of it.
Wonderful. Absolutely. So thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. It is always my pleasure to engage with you, and certainly on a topic that is so close to my heart and central to the research that I do. So the report in question is entitled Rethinking Community Safety, a Step Forward for Toronto. And this report I was engaged in through my work with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, who you know very well, of course. I'm a special advisor to the CCLA on anti-Black racism. And the Toronto Neighbourhood Centres really led the co-development of this report in partnership with a number of different community institutions and agencies across Toronto. And this was coming largely out of calls to defund the police, which of course emerged most loudly last summer following the death of George Floyd and others. And I think it's important just to kind of pause there for a moment and acknowledge, first of all, that although calls to defund and detask the police have grown extremely loud in the last 12 months, the conversations about the size of police budgets and the role and functions of the police long predate these most recent calls, right? So in the city of Toronto specifically, which we will talk about, there's been concern around the growth of the police budget for years now, right? Each time as the budget approached $1 billion and surpassed $1 billion, there were conversations about the cost of policing. This has been true as well at a national level here in Canada. The Canadian Associations of Chiefs of Police in the last several years have examined not only the growth in police budgets and highlighting constraints to their budgets that are likely to come, but also the expanding role of police in our society. And so in thinking about this report, I think we should think about it in a broader context of the work around and attention to both the budgetary aspects, but the growth and the what we might call mission or function creep of the police. So to the report specifically, again, with colleagues at the CCLA, we provided input and guidance and resources where we had them at our fingertips that would help representatives of these organizations think through the various issues that we have in relation to policing today, and specifically in relation to the calls for defunding the police. And so looking, and situating this conversation and the report itself in acknowledgement of racial and racial injustice and other forms of inequality that serve to drive policing, I think, in many ways, because I think policing both responds to and perpetuates various forms of inequality. And then to look at the specific areas that may be addressed and the types of services, and this is important, just to pause, in thinking about defunding the police, I prefer to talk about detasking the police. So I start from the acknowledgement that we're asking the police to do too much, that their role, that their scope has grown too much, and that they're asked to do things that they're ill-equipped to do and that have a number of negative consequences associated with their involvement. The funding part for me comes as a response. We take some of the responsibility away from the police, and with that goes their funds. But the key areas, and we will talk about these kind of in more depth, are looking at the policing of homelessness, mental health, policing of young people generally, and looking at gender-based violence, and then how we might respond to community issues. So looking simply at the 911 dispatch system. So again, our role was largely one of guidance and review and input, but I think and I want to commend the various community organizations who really drove the work, and they're the people who have the knowledge and the experience necessary to help us understand how we can detask and defund and rethink policing in modern cities.
Well, it's wonderful. I have to say, it's a fabulous report to read. The footnotes are really engaging, and you can see it's a comprehensive, well-researched report. And as you say, it speaks a little bit to if police do too much, if other people would be better able to respond to some of the issues in our society, then why not? And I have to say, I read it also from a position of having been not only at the CCLA when we were starting to look at the carding issues, but also from a law reform perspective, where we were concerned about the increasing criminalization of everything. There was only one type of response, and it was let's criminalize this and let's engage in a law and order response to all our problems. So we may want to go back to this, but the beginning, I think, and it makes a really quite a lot of recommendations about really a commitment to community safety that certainly is committed in ensuring the safety of all communities in Toronto, not just a few. And then that police is not the most appropriate means to address community safety in all settings. So, and particularly, let's talk a little bit about the mental health aspect. I think that's, I think it's one of the issues that comes up often. Lots of violence have been experienced in that context. where are we going? Where were you going? What's the vision of how it could work out?
Yeah, so I think the mental health one, and we've seen very clearly, I'm sure many people that are listening and watching us now have seen at least some footage of someone who's experiencing mental health crisis, who either themselves or a family member or someone close to them had called the police for help, and stated very clearly that this person was in distress, that they needed help. The police respond and very quickly resort to the use of force, right? And so I think mental health is one of clearly the key areas that we need to look at. And we can acknowledge, so I will go back to one of the things that you just said that we might come back to is, in thinking about this, we can think about the policification of social policy. And this is a term that's been developed by British academics to talk about how we are now responding to many social ills and using the police as a key tool of social policy. And so we can think about the divestment from a variety of social sectors, including, the mental health sector. And I think the mental health and the homelessness go hand in hand. But as people were deinstitutionalized, as funds were taken away from mental health centers, mental health supports, we see an increasing presence of people who are either on the street or not on the street, who are suffering from mental health problems. And too often it's the police that respond. And there are a number of different things that are going on, I think, with respect to the policing aspect of this. Like, first and foremost is the way in which police are trained to respond to people, to take control of situations, and the fact that de-escalation is something that's only really entering police training and policing in a very real way now, as opposed to this show of strength and show of authority. And so the police are called to intervene with an individual who is in clear mental health distress. That person is erratic, is acting and behaving in what might be seen by the police as an erratic manner. They're uncontrollable, or seemingly uncontrollable, in the swift manner in which the police would like to resolve the situation. And so the police resort to using force against those individuals. And so this is problematic, of course, not only because they may resort to using force, but also resort to criminalizing these individuals as well, right? So if, for example, they're to swat the police officer's hand away as they come close, or spit on a police officer or anything like that, then they may get arrested for resisting arrest, for assault police. And so clearly sending armed agents of the state who are positioned to enforce the law and not trained and not equipped to deal with people who are suffering from mental health crises and mental health problems, sending those individuals is not the right call. And so our goal here was simply to talk about and to lay out, the extent to which policing has become a primary response to mental health problems, to talk about the overrepresentation of people suffering from mental health crisis in, as I've said, kind of use of force situations and the other negative outcomes, and then to highlight other options. And I think this is the area, this is the area for me. And clearly I can ramble, so I'm going to try not to ramble too long.
No, that's okay. It's great.
There are numerous examples of alternative responses to people in crisis. And so in the report, the leaders, the key drivers of the report did a jurisdictional scan, and the city of Toronto has done a similar jurisdictional scan. And this is the area that has got the most traction in Toronto. Okay. So the city of Toronto itself has undertaken to develop an alternative response to people in mental health crises. And when you look across Canada and you look across much of the West, there are numerous examples where community agencies, either themselves or community agencies in partnership with the police, where the police take a back seat, have intervention teams that respond to people who are suffering from mental health crisis. Yeah. And they respond in a way that is like largely trauma informed, that is a more treatment oriented and service oriented driven approach. So these people are well equipped to both with the knowledge of how to approach people who are in mental health distress, but also have an understanding of what it is they need. And it's not a jail cell, it's not a holding cell, right? It's not a court, it's not a prison. And when we look, the overrepresentation of people suffering from mental health problems and with mental health problems in prison is staggering, right? And so we lay out a number of ways in which this could be expanded. The basic infrastructure in terms of organizations such as the Gernstein Crisis Center in Toronto and a number of others focusing on adult and youth and specific subpopulations exists. And so it's a matter of further institutionalizing and further funding and building out existing structures and really encouraging the police to either remove themselves to the full extent possible or take a back seat and let mental health crisis response be led by these other agencies. And this will reduce calls directly to the police if there are separate services that are established. It'll reduce a lot of police work even when the police do have to respond. And importantly, it will save lives and it will reduce both the harm and trauma caused by this type of policing.
Yeah, it's fabulous to read the conclusion of the report that says, you know, $115 million funds could really help a lot develop a network that actually is efficient and provides the appropriate response. And I take it that a similar thinking is what's going on with respect to dealing with homelessness and even with the 911 calls. It's the idea of taking a back seat a little bit and as opposed to the front uniformed officer coming to establish authority. So I guess anything on homelessness that was interesting?
Homelessness one. Yeah, well, absolutely. I think like just pausing for a moment and thinking about like what it means and what the end result of sending a police officer to deal with homelessness is going to be, like, to me is just like nonsensical from this starting point, right? So acknowledging that some people experiencing homelessness may engage in crime that the police do need to respond to, but many crimes and you know, crimes are socially constructed phenomenon, right? They're behaviors that we decide that we want to make illegal. Many of the crimes that the police respond to are crimes that are specific to people that are homeless, right? Like there are crimes of poverty. So trespassing, sleeping in public, urinating, drinking in public, all of those, you know, public order types of crime. So again, in thinking about like nonsensical approaches, the idea that by ticketing these individuals, we're going to reduce the likelihood that they're going to sleep on the street, that they're going to drink in public, that they'll have to urinate in public or do whatever it is else that it is that they're likely to be doing, seems rather foolish to me, right? And
very costly, it turned out.
Extremely costly. So we've got like the police that, and so like just pausing for a second and thinking about the mental health and the homelessness piece. Police officers in Canada, police officers in Toronto are paid very well. And I don't mind that at all. The better paid police are, the less likely they are to engage in corrupt behavior. But where that becomes problematic is where you have a police constable who could easily be making $100,000 a year with a bit of overtime, responding to situations that someone that's properly equipped to respond to those situations and trained would be paid a fraction, perhaps a third, maybe a half of what they're being paid. So we're wasting a lot of money on the policing side, as well as the consequences of, for example, ticketing the homeless. You ticket a homeless person for doing something that they shouldn't be doing in public. The likelihood of that ticket getting paid is marginal. So what happens? That person is then subject to proper criminal penalties, subject to arrest. So they end up going through our court system and ending up in our jails. So the amount of money spent, and then we think about, again, the negative outcomes of that. We're further enabling people to operate and to function properly in our society by saddling them with criminal records, right? There are various forms of trauma that are experienced by people who experience aggressive and pervasive forms of policing. And so we're trying to deal, again, with a social problem through a criminal justice approach that is like not only ineffective, but it is absolutely counterproductive. It is completely counterproductive. And so if we think about the amount of money that can be saved and the amount of kind of human and social capital that could be recouped by, again, using other services that many of which already exist in, you know, a city like Toronto.
It's interesting because there's some similar studies done in Montreal to count how much ticketing someone and then arresting them and then as cost versus the constructions of safe beds and so on. So I think the movement to, and I think this report is so well done because it shines a light on the racial dimensions of the issue and the impact that it has on racialized community, but also offers solutions, you know, which I think it's a great strength of it. Let's move to probably what is maybe a bit more controversial, which is its take on gender-based violence. And I'd like to hear a little bit how they came about this and the conclusion that they've reached.
Yeah, and this is one I must admit that I have the least amount of familiarity with, given that it's not a kind of a central part of my work, but one that I was fascinated as well through the process and with the outcome here. So the report proposes a number of alternatives to dealing with gender-based violence, a number of alternatives to a police response to dealing with gender-based violence. And it's not to say I don't think that a police response is completely unnecessary here. But the bottom line is that, again, too often a police and a justice response to dealing with gender-based violence kind of further marginalizes and jeopardizes the actual personal safety of the victim or the survivor of gender-based violence. And so at the moment, there's too much attention being paid to the perpetrator and not enough attention being paid to the survivor. So by providing a variety of supports to the survivor of that gender-based violence, instead of taking such a harsh policing type approach, then their outcomes in terms of housing stability, financial stability, and importantly, their own physical safety are much improved. And so what we see from the data is that, first and foremost, too often, and you've noted here that there are clear intersections between race and other forms of socioeconomic inequality and other forms of marginalization. So we're talking oftentimes about impoverished, or too often about impoverished and racialized populations. And so oftentimes the survivors aren't treated very well by the police first and foremost, right? And we hear this oftentimes in the Canadian context, too often in the Indigenous situation, right? Very.
Well, indeed, I think that part of the report is interesting because the whole report, and we're going to try to put a link to it in the chat so people can have a look. And if you're listening and you want to have questions, put them up, and I will put them to our guest in a couple minutes. The report talks about over-policing. The expression over-policing is used to describe a little bit what, over-tasking of the police and so on. And in the literature, sometimes victims say, yeah, well, when you're a racialized woman, you're under-policed. They don't respond to your call. So there's this tension between when are we over-policing, when is it, what's the right amount of policing that we should expect, and how do we measure that?
So this is a wonderful question. If I had the answer, maybe we wouldn't be talking. I'd be running a police agency or a public safety department somewhere, something like that. The phenomenon of being over-policed and underprotected is an important one, right? This idea that, within many communities and many demographic groups, the police are there to stop and question them, to arrest them for minor infractions, and to come down quite harshly on legal and illegal behavior, but they're not there when those same populations are victimized, or when they are there, they're not treated as deserving victims, right? They're undeserving victims, and their victimization is not taken seriously. We've seen this quite recently in the case of Colton Boushie, right? And Colton Boushie's mom, and the way in which she was treated by the RCMP when they came to tell her that her son had died. So very clearly here is a woman who is the victim of whose son had been victimized, and she being victimized, and she's being treated in a discriminatory manner. So the question, what is the right amount of policing? I think that is a multifaceted question, and I think it would depend on exactly what we want to look at. So are we looking at police strength, like how many police officers do we need? That would depend largely on how we use them. I think, how would we measure how much police we need? In part through a mix of an examination of statistical data. Crime data is a funny thing. Like, police generated crime data tell us as much about what the police are doing as they do about the volume of crime in a given area, right? So if the police decide to pay attention to a certain geographical area or a certain type of criminal offending, then that's going to show up in the data. There are certain types of crimes, homicide, for example, that's less apt for. But we would want to examine, police reported crime data and to determine what some of the issues that are taking place. But importantly, I think that a lot of focus here has to be on various communities, right? The police answer to multiple audiences. So you talked a little bit about carding earlier. The phenomenon of police stopping and documenting largely young Black and brown men was one that came under a lot of criticism from certain segments of society, but was also supported by other segments of society who thought that was the type of policing that was needed to keep them safe, right? Please do stop and search and document the other so that I'm safe. But I think that and we often engage in this type of work, satisfaction surveys, community satisfaction surveys, public satisfaction surveys, to understand whether the police are doing a satisfactory job of convincing people that they're keeping their neighborhood safe, of being approachable and easy to talk to. Much of policing is a public relations exercise, right? How they treat individuals, both writ large and in specific instances, has a great influence on how people perceive the level of safety in their communities and how they perceive the police. And so I think for me, it's less about the amount of policing and it's much more about the quality of policing. And that quality of policing needs to be quality policing for all members of society, not just specific groups who are seen as, deserving, as more legitimate, as more civil parts of our population.
It was interesting for me as well when I was reading it. I mean, the link to quality policing and trust and that exists in our society. But it because this summit is a little bit about constitutional wrangling between different jurisdictions on one hand, and on the other hand, this sort of real democratic project that we're talking about, ensuring that the services are done exempt of racism and in a way that responds well to all communities. On the wrangling side, on the jurisdictional wrangling side, it seemed to me that like criminal law and policing are just the epitome of different jurisdiction. In Canada, it's the federal government that defines criminal law. It has the jurisdiction over the criminal code, and so if it enacts some way in making something a crime or increasing some penalty for a crime, it has an impact down the road and policing. And then the provinces are the ones that are training police officers. They're the one that are providing the accountability framework for police officers. And then the municipalities are in the delivery of it, So it was interesting to see what can the city of Toronto do to resist a little bit some of the law and order visions that may have predated and may be part of what you call the, politizations of social or policification of social problems. So is that an issue that should be addressed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I've been thinking about this a lot. One of the things that I would like to see in Canada is like an accreditation standard for police, and a standard that police across the country should be held to. And I think that could be done at a federal level and apply across the country. But to answer your actual question, what can we do in a city like Toronto, given the fact that the province does hold so much sway over policing with respect to being the, the guardian of the Police Services Act, and recognizing, of course, like funding constraints. I think by building out the community infrastructure, the organizations and the institutions that we know play a key role, an important role in public safety and in community safety, by adequately resourcing, funding, and prioritizing those alternatives to policing, I think in many ways we can remove some of the need for policing. So it's really a matter of looking at the upstream factors. What are the issues that the police respond to? What are the societal problems that we have that we expect the police to respond to at the moment? And as opposed to waiting for the police to need to respond to those, we create a situation, a society, an environment in which there is less need for that police response. The police are always, they're going to act like any effective bureaucracy and ensure their future. And we've seen this now. The police are doing what they can to take a lead role in this alternative to police response to people dealing with mental health crisis. And I am, vehemently opposed to that. I think the police need to take a step back. But by building out and properly supporting the various organizations, like the ones that led the creation, it was nice to see Rob from
yes.
Toronto Neighborhood Centers here. So I commend all of the work that went into this. And it really is just an excellent and a fantastic resource. But by it's not just a matter of funding, it's prioritizing these alternatives and to an extent, removing police from their presence in many of these alternatives. Like when we look at funding, for example, for youth programming, so much funding for youth programming, like directed in a city like Toronto, is directed at crime prevention and anti-violence and anti-gang strategies, right?
Yeah.
There are prenatal care has a crime prevention effect, right? But we don't send the police to prenatal care centers to ensure that mothers are getting the good care that they need. It's a matter of properly establishing these and dealing with upstream factors.
So let's hear it from the audience here. We have lots of good questions in the chat. So let me start with something that we're talking about, and is the Jesse Singer, and says, we've seen strong pushback in Vancouver against even freezing the existing police budget. Do you have any advice on how to elevate the detasking approach message in public discourse to being a more effective way to garner broad-based support that would achieve the same ends as the defunding messaging? Any advice through Jesse?
Absolutely. So thank you for that question, Jesse. This is one that some people have been critical of my use of the term detasking as opposed to defunding, but I really think that it is the sensible approach in terms of what we actually want the police to do, and it is the more politically, in many ways, acceptable approach. So I use it for strategic reasons. The first thing that we need to know if we're going to try and detask the police is what the police actually do. Yep. So I'm assuming you're in Vancouver, you're talking about Vancouver. I don't think that you would be able to find information on how all of that police money is actually spent. There may be a breakdown of the budget, but we don't have a good sense of like what police calls for service are, how much police time is spent enforcing traffic laws, how much police time is spent doing community policing, how much police time is spent doing all of the different things. In many ways, we actually don't know what all of the different things that the police do are. So here in Toronto, one of the things that we've, with a group of researchers that I'm working with, is trying to get a hold of information that will shed light on what the police actually do. And then from there, we can identify how much time and resources is being spent and directed on doing these types of activities that we don't think the police should be doing because they're either ineffective at doing so and they're the inappropriate agency to do so. And from there, we can think about the amount of money spent, conduct an environmental scan to see what other organizations and agencies are out there that can do the work that would be detasked from the police, and then see the movement, the shifting of those funds from the police to these other agencies. And there needs to be perhaps some lag time between the removal of funds from the police and its
reinvestment.
A reinvestment in these other areas. But I think first and foremost, we need to find out what the police do. We need to find out how much of what these various activities are costing us, who else could be doing them, and go from there.
So it's interesting, there's two questions here about the governance of policing. Typically, I think when we say Toronto, we mean the Toronto Police Service Board that is in charge of managing the budget. But a question is being asked also from Alex Flynn that says, my question is about the role of municipal governments when it comes to policing. Are city council the right governments to be making decisions about this? It seems like they haven't stepped up on issues like police budgets so far, at least not in Canada. Would love your thoughts. And similarly, I think Andrew Sancton says, when Nathalie refers to the City of Toronto, does she mean the Toronto City Council or the Toronto Police Service Board? Does Akwasi, do you believe that the mayor and council should be directly responsible for police policy and budgeting?
So this is how to get the right balance here. And so acknowledging, of course, that the Police Services Board are there to provide a certain level of oversight and direction for the police, right? And then acknowledging that there are various appointees to that Police Service Board, some appointed by the province, there are city representatives, of course, police representatives and the like. So we have a bit of a mix here. I think one of the questions or statements was that our municipalities, our cities, our city councils haven't stepped up in this respect. And I think part of that is a product of the power that both the police and police unions have, right? So it's fairly politically disadvantageous for a mayor or for a city councillor to come out and be critical of the police, because the police do wield a lot of political power. Do I think that city councils and mayors or municipal governments the right people to be kind of developing and directing police policy and budget? I think that with the input of a relatively broad spectrum of the community, and I don't know how one would do that, like how you get proper community representation. I do think they are, because they are more in tune with local issues, right? So you need to understand the nature of the municipality and the problems facing that municipality in order to police it properly, in order to ensure that there's the correct amount of policing alongside the other social services that you want to provide, right? So
Yeah.
policing to me is just part of a series of policing is simply a part of a series of kind of social institutions, right? And so I think, I look at the United Kingdom, and they've got a different kind of oversight model where you've got these kind of elected, and you look at the US, of course, I'll leave the US out, but you look at the United Kingdom, very different context, like 30 odd police agencies across the country. And it's much more, in many ways, I don't want to say centralized, but much more simple. We certainly don't have this like tri-level of government involvement in the work and the setting of laws, but they have kind of elected representatives that have more oversight and play a greater role in directing what the police do. And so I think a bit of a mix or a balance of elected representation of members of a given municipality in conjunction with municipal officials would be the right approach. But the question then, the key question in a city as large and as diverse in the true sense of the word as Toronto is, how do you achieve representation, right? That is going to be something that's going to be, and how do you then achieve any kind of consensus?
So it looks like this question of governance and oversight by mayors or by city officials or by city elected people at the city council is also appearing in Montreal, where we're told the mayor says she has little control over the police budget. City council can increase, decrease the budget, but doesn't have control over line items, and asking whether that's the case elsewhere in Canada. How did we get there is the question. How did this come about, and what is the rationale for this approach, and how do we overcome it as a barrier to reform?
I can't unfortunately actually speak to like the various jurisdictions across Canada and whether that would be the same. Part of my kind of understanding and guess would be that, like, how did we get here is that we actually wouldn't want or there's been of having politicians too closely involved in directing what the police do. So we want some separation, of course, between like the police and elected and appointed officials, in that we don't want politics driving police action, right? Like we can look at Doug Ford in Ontario and his close connections to police appointees and kind of the troubles there as an example of why
it's a part of almost civil liberties that you need a bit of a separation.
Judicial independence, in a sense, we've got a bit of independence of the chief from this kind of direction. And so then again, a question is raised, if money is diverted away from the police to other agencies, like should the police then do the police get to choose as they would largely where like the money is spent, or could we do something to ensure that the money is being taken from the areas that we don't think need to be dealt with within the policing realm and sent to those other areas. So this is, this is one of the key, like this jurisdictional question is one that is key.
So that obviously it's not the first time that we've reflected on the governance of policing in Canada, and I think it will continue. And it's particularly complex, I think, as well in places like Nova Scotia, where one of the big challenges, obviously, the shared jurisdiction between municipal police and the RCMP. And so the question is whether, in your experience, there's an increased reticence to change within the ranks of the RCMP as it relates to its model of policing, and whether you have any recommendations for techniques to advocate for transformation of this model of policing in this interjurisdictional space here.
So this is a great question. I think, even almost from the top, there's certainly a reluctance to change within policing, period, right? I think that's part of like the police working culture. and I'm generalizing in a big way here. I think one of the things that we have seen in policing in the last 10 years, especially, largely in major municipalities and perhaps to an extent in the RCMP, is a drastic change in recruitment. And so the type of people who are becoming police officers. And so they're typically older, they're much more educated, and they have more life experience. And I think that that is going to be a huge factor in facilitating or fostering transformation within these organizations. Unfortunately, there are a couple of things again at the moment that are still happening. The people that lead these organizations, both at the top, but then across, when we think about the RCMP, the different divisions, the senior management are still from the old school in many ways, right? And so I think, and we saw this from Brenda Lucky last summer when she stumbled over trying to define what systemic racism is, that like in many ways they simply do not get it, right? Like I think part of the problems with respect to transformational change is an actual ignorance on the part of many police leaders, a simple lack of knowledge. And then other factors are, again, resistance from the police membership certainly still exists, and this idea. And I think part of the resistance is actually coming in direct response to calls for change, right? And
it's scary.
feeling that they're being compelled to do so. So I do think, and I've seen, and I know the RCMP is doing work right now with respect to trying to change the way in which racialized members are treated and how they are or not do or don't advance through the ranks. Obviously, they're doing a lot or paying a lot of attention to issues of gender inequality and sexual violence and assault within the ranks, of course. But I think it'll be a while, especially for the RCMP, before we see drastic change.
Well, it's, another good questions here from Keith Gerain, who's a journalism fellow at Massey. What does the evidence say about the best ways to reduce police misbehavior and overuse of force? Is it body cams, dash cams, de-escalation training, diversity hiring or training, the accountability, like the independent investigation of complaints? It seems that many of these ideas have been tried and to some degree, but have not been able to change things as was hoped. What do you think?
Well, thank you for this question, Keith. And I've got a grin on my face because we're currently doing a national study looking at police use of force and best practices and how to deal with the body cams, the dash cams, the de-escalation training, diversity hiring, of course, all coming up, independent investigation. The evidence is out on the body cams and the dash cams. The evidence is mixed. Certainly the de-escalation training, I think, holds some promise, and beyond just simple training, it's working to change police culture around like the use of force. And in the United Kingdom, the police take an oath to protect life, and that's something that we don't have here. And oftentimes we see the opposite when the police respond, unfortunately. Let me answer your question with probably like the most one of the most effective ways to manage this is actually through the use of data. So amongst the greatest predictors of identifying officers that are going to use force is whether or not they've used force and used force inappropriately in the past. So you can review previous use of force data to identify officers that are at increased risk of using force. The same goes for citizen complaints, right? Officers who are likely to mistreat citizens are likely to have mistreated citizens in the past. And so you can identify that through data. So I'm a large proponent of data-driven initiatives to address both use of force and appropriate use of force and incivility in policing generally. Early warning systems, flag systems can be developed. So when an officer, for example, has 3 use of force reports submitted within the span of a year or a set period of time, that will send a signal to their supervisor. The supervisor can then review their use of force reports to see what has happened. That individual then might be brought in for questioning, for an interview to see what's happened. If necessary, they could be sent for remedial training. If training doesn't work, then they could be subject to some kind of disciplinary action. I think one of the things that we don't see enough of unfortunately, within policing is disciplinary action taken against officers, right? Like, again, the culture of silence and protectionism is just too great. And so officers need to be held accountable. I do think that independent investigation of complaints and oversight agencies do hold a lot of promise. And I think we have to acknowledge that in the Canadian context, although our oversight agencies do face a lot of scrutiny, that we are in a quite fortunate position to have the infrastructure and institutionalization of police oversight where we have it in the country to the extent that we do. It could certainly be strengthened and it be reformed itself, but I'm happy that we have what we do.
Yeah, this was a big issue at the CCLA about the continuing to build an oversight mechanism that was responsive, that was transparent, but there's always room to do.
I see John Sewell's here, who might know a thing and the police about the de-escalation and anything else. As 20 years, and this is key, right? The training, the culture eats training. Officers spend, months in training, and we always hear this, and then they get to their police service, they're sent out with a field training officer, and the first thing they hear is, forget everything that you heard at the academy, right? This is what policing is actually about. And that culture is absolutely key. And I think, the carrots in many ways haven't worked. And this is why I suggest the stick, the disciplinary action. And then we could go into a whole conversation about officers who are facing disciplinary action being suspended with pay, right? Because that's in the news again, as a number of Toronto police officers are facing disciplinary action. And there again, we have mayors and police chiefs and municipal services and municipalities wanting to be able to suspend officers with pay, and the Police Services Act not letting that happen. So I'm going on a tangent, but Don, thank you very much for Mr. Sewell, thank you for that comment. Absolutely, culture is huge here.
Yeah, and it will continue to be so for a while, but should still trying to make sure that there's voices of change within the rank and file. So there's some comments as well about all the guns, tasers, in a way about the tools of policing that have been created, and the weaponry that is part both of the training but also of the day-to-day experience of citizens with police. One asked, how do you combat this? How do you combat if body cam's the only options, when she's talking about the proper reporting by police officers of incidents of abuses? How effective, the question continues by say, is body cams the only option, and how effective may that be with potential overload of data? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't actually. You raise a good question. Using data depends on proper reporting by police officers. Of course it does, right? Absolutely. And so I wonder the extent to which force is used in, for example, the city of Toronto and then not reported. And we know that likely happens. So I don't think that, again, body cameras are necessarily the answer to that, because body cameras can be turned on and off as well, depending on the model and how they're used too. I do think, though, that we've got a situation now, for example, like various forms of misconduct are if a supervisor becomes aware of a form of misconduct, then they have a duty, right, a responsibility to report that. And so the same could go for use of force. I don't think I have a good question. I wouldn't rely strictly on body cameras. Again, it would be trying to work towards a cultural shift. If officers knew that if they used force and they didn't report it, that they were going to be subject to serious sanctions, then I think that would increase the likelihood that they would file the use of force reports that would then go into the databases that could be reviewed.
So we're coming to, we have 10 more minutes. You wanted to say something. Sorry, I didn't want to.
Well, no, I wanted to ask that question about disarming rank and file officers, because I think there's some merit to that as well. And I think to alternatives. So one of the things that we've seen, there's an example in Whitehorse, for example, the name's slipping my mind. There are examples in other jurisdictions of community safety officers that are not sworn police officers. So these are individuals who may be in some kind of uniform who respond to low-level disorder and minor offending, but without a traditional police response. the community safety officer patrols have been shown to be as effective as police patrols, or as similarly targeted police patrols in, I don't want to say deterring crime, but in deterring crime. And so I do wonder, I'm initially from England. I was born in the UK, where, you know, most of the officers, rank and file officers, do not walk around with firearms. They have squads of officers who would be in vehicles, for example, in a city like London, who would be able to respond quickly. I do think that we should seriously consider disarming some officers, or creating another tier of community safety officer that could respond to certain incidents. Of course, the huge difference between the United Kingdom and Canada is the prevalence of guns, right? And so so I think, you know, I'm not in support of the militarization of police. I don't like many of the toys that the police have, but I do think it's reasonable to believe that the police should be able to respond with an equal or greater level of force than they would potentially see in the public. The problem is that the police are responding with way too much force too often, with individuals that are not only, you know, that are not only less armed than them, but are too often not armed at all, right? So if you take the gun out of the equation, that gun cannot be used. Again, try that on with the police union, the police association. You're going to have a fight on your hands. But I do think there's
and that's another question that was in the chat a little bit about the role of police unions. In general, I think freedom of association and support for unionization exist. And so the question is whether we should continue to be so supportive of unionization of police officers. I just want to pause to add to one aspect of my own work, where they've proved in I think it's in the military, when the military they were trying to be unionized, is that if you give people rights, they tend to want to respect rights. You know, if you deprive them of rights, then they have far less skin in the game, in a sense, in participating in a constitutional upholding of rights. But I want to hear you, whether you have some comments on the unions and the police unions.
I'm a professor at a university that has a union that protects my rights, right? And I've benefited from unions and associations in other employment capacities. And so I certainly wouldn't want to say that we need to, you know, wholesale do away with police associations or police unions. I think that there needs to be checks placed on them. Exactly how we would go about that, I'm uncertain. You know, the police associations are supposed to be there to protect the well-being of their members, and too often I feel that the police associations protect the well-being of themselves. So if we look, for example, at, you know, many of the issues that we discussed initially, and we didn't even touch the drugs issue, right? But police officers every day in a city like Toronto are sent to deal with people in mental health crisis, are policing the homeless, are policing people who have substance use issues, who may be overdosing. They're sent into situations that have a grave impact on their own mental health, right? If I were the leader of a police association, I would recognize that by taking many of the tasks that we're talking about away from the police and giving them to better trained people, that the day-to-day lives of my membership would be much better, right? And so if I were a police association leader who was genuinely interested in the well-being of my members, then much of the proposals in this report and that are coming along with detasking and defunding the police would actually make sense to me. And the fact that the unions are so staunchly opposed to even having these conversations tells me that they're less interested in the well-being of their members and of course themselves. Police associations exist on police dues, right? The less officers, the less dues, the less money they have, the less buildings to buy, the less they can send their executives off on vacations and things like that. And so again, just like the police agency is a bureaucracy, these associations are their own beings, and they tend to grow and often, too oftentimes, go in their own directions.
That's interesting, because the issue of privatization of police and the hiring of security guard raised similar issue, and that may be another aspect that we should have a dialogue about. What's the future of private security in this context as well? I want to just end, we're coming to the end of our hour here. The report is so eloquent in you know, making statements like over-policing youth does not make communities safer. So in a way, it takes a frontal attack on these old theories of the broken window syndrome, where which seem to have framed public policy for so long, where, you know, you needed to respond with force at every slight little indignities because otherwise you were letting the city go. So is that it? Is that, have we just, is the broken window theory out the window? And pardon me the pun there, but or was it ever reliable? Why did it catch so much? Why did it have such value in public policy discussions?
I think perhaps because it was seen as responsible for the New York miracle, right? When the article came out in the Atlantic, when it did, and the broken windows and zero tolerance and public order forms of policing were advanced to the extent that they were, New York saw a drastic decrease in crime, and that drastic decrease in crime was associated with the initiation of these types of policing policies, negating the fact that that same decrease in crime was seen across jurisdictions that did not institute those same policies, right? And this was also an era, like we need to remember, and this is when, you know, I started thinking about these issues really, and I was young at the time. Crime peaking in the mid 1990s, right? And in certain jurisdictions in the States, things were bad, right? They were bad. Violence was high. Gun violence was high in many jurisdictions, and so people were looking for solutions. So I don't think broken windows ever worked to the extent that it was supposed to. We had conversations then around super predators. I think we can acknowledge now that having the criminal justice system, having the police intervene in the lives of young people can, and we see this in studies, especially, you know, with Black youth who experience police contact early in their lives are more likely to engage in crime than those who don't, right? So I think that's, you know, something that seriously needs to be considered. The report talks about scared straight programs, which are key, but the simple experience of a police stop and an aggressive police stop increases the likelihood of engaging in criminal behavior, increases both physical and mental health problems in those same populations. Yeah,
I have to say, I think the report's quite eloquent about the school to prison pipeline. And one expression that I thought was really interesting is to move away from over-policing to more community-based, asset-oriented approach, you know, believing in the possibility of the youth as an asset for our cities. So we're coming to the end. So I just want to thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Rob for being part of this excellent work. I think we will want to continue to discuss it and to see where it's going. So thank you all, and I invite you to stay with the Massey Cities Summit. We're coming to the end of our summit, where we're going to a little bit summarize what we've learned and what are the next steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you.